Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 58. The Other Shoe Has Dropped. The next morning saw Izuku stalking to the library with a purpose. He was going to find everything there was to know about hawks. He gave the Shinsos his usual greetings and got down to business. Hawks. Real name, unknown. Agency affiliation, unknown. 21 years old. It was only his second year on the hero scene, and he had already breached the top 100. But there were barely any news articles or clips of him online. How was that possible? It was a ranking of public opinion. How could he be ranked that highly if the public hardly knew anything about him? Something didn't add up. Too much of his personality was an act. Not that Izuku had much room to judge on that front, but he still didn't trust him one bit. There were too many unknowns and too many equations that didn't add up, though, again, it's not like Izuku had much room to judge. The one thing that he couldn't shake out of his mind was the fear. The longer he thought about it, the more he was sure whatever was driving him to cover up his personality, whatever made him construct this persona, was rooted in fear. Izuku was well acquainted with the art of using faux confidence to hide how scared you were. He just had no clue why Hawks was doing the same. He had the perfect quirk. The things he could do with it were endless. It could be long or short-ranged. It could be offensive or defensive. It was perfect. So why was he so afraid? Midoriya? He was having a crisis staring at his sparse collection of news articles when Shinso called his name. He looked serious, like he needed to talk. Well, freaking dagnabbit. Yeah, Shinso? He replied, trying his best to pull himself together. I wanted to ask you if, He cut himself off and scrubbed his face with his hands before continuing. Why haven't you asked about that night? About me? He finally blurted out. Kami. He knew this talk was coming. Shinso had been antsy ever since it happened. He knew he was going to want to talk about it, but why now? He already had so much crap going on. You seemed uncomfortable, and I didn't want to make it worse, he responded. It wasn't a lie, but it definitely wasn't the full truth. I am, but you're acting like it never happened, and I feel like I'm going crazy. I know you saw, and you're not stupid. I know that you know. He cut himself off. Shinso, I don't know what you want me to say, he said honestly. Shinso looked at him like he was lost, like he didn't really know what he wanted either. I don't know, he finally conceded. You're not mad at me, are you? Well, he just had to ask that, didn't he? Yes, Izuku was mad, but not for the reasons Shinso was probably worried about. He wasn't mad that he had hid this from him. He understood that, and he wasn't mad that he could do what he could do. Shinso had no control over that. No, he was just jealous. Just plain old jealous. But Shinso didn't need to know that. He couldn't know that. No, Shinso, I'm not mad at you, he asserted. Shinso looked at him with his brow furrowed, like he couldn't quite believe him. You're not scared? He asked so quietly that Izuku barely heard him. The way he said it broke Izuku's heart. He knew that people must have mistreated Shinso because of his quirk. He knew they must have either hated or feared him. He knew there were probably very few people who knew what Shinso could do and still trusted him, but the way Shinso looked so afraid and unsure of himself really drove that point home. No, Shinso, I'm not scared of you, he stated with finality. I trust you. Shinso looked like he was about to cry. He was biting his lip to stop it from shaking and looking down at the floor, and Izuku had no idea what he was supposed to do, so he just sat there as each awkward second passed by. Your quirk is amazing, Shinso. You can do so much good with it. You could stop a hostage situation with a single word. I can see why people might think it's scary, but maybe they're just not creative enough to see the good you could do, that you will do, he added when the air got too stiff with silence. Shinso looked up at that. His eyes were glassy, and he looked shocked. He looked like he was studying Izuku's face to see if he was lying. When he seemed satisfied that he wasn't, his shoulders untensed and his expression softened. You know, I wouldn't I won't be mad at you either, he said. Oh, balls. You can I mean, I understand how people get about quirks, he added. Izuku felt his stomach drop down to his feet. You can tell me, he finished awkwardly as his gaze met Izuku's. Izuku was frozen. His hands were shaking. He knew they were. He had to say something. Shinso was looking at him with concern. He looked like he wanted to say something else. He kept opening and closing his mouth like he was going to speak before deciding against it. He was supposed to say something now. He had to say something. I I can't, he had stood up. He doesn't remember standing up. Shinso looked frightened or concerned. He couldn't tell through his own panic. I can't, I need to go, he stuttered out before grabbing his bag and booking it out of the library. Cheesy freaking rice. What the freak was that? Why the frick did he just do that? Why did Shinso have to ask that? His shuddering limbs took him to an alley not too far from the library before they collapsed under him. He backed against the wall and hugged his knees to his chest, trying to suck air into his lungs with little success. He was curled in on himself, hyperventilating in a dirty alleyway, and dang it, that wasn't the best place for him to lose control like this. He didn't have a good track record of coming out of alleyway panic attacks unscathed. He tried to remind himself that this wasn't uptown and it was broad daylight, but whenever that fear subsided, the memory of what had just happened came creeping back, and that wasn't any more relaxing than being left to bleed out in a pile of rubbish beside a dumpster. Freak. He screwed up. He screwed up everything. He could have lied. He could have made up some useless quirk, something, anything. But what he did, there was no cover story for that. He couldn't lie his way out of that. Shinso probably thought he had some sort of heinous quirk now. He couldn't justify that reaction with something benign. He stayed shaking in that alley until his phone's alarm went off, telling him he needed to get to school, and he let his limbs guide him on autopilot. Hitoshi stood in place, dumbstruck, after Midoriya darted out of the room. What the heck was that? He didn't know what to feel. Part of him was angry that Midoriya looked so scared of him, but another part understood that fear completely. He was in the same situation as Midoriya. He was scared of his reaction too, but he had literally just said with full confidence that he was not afraid of Hitoshi, that he trusted him. Clearly that was a lie. He looked terrified and didn't trust him enough to tell him crap. But Midoriya didn't owe him an explanation, did he? Was that fair for Hitoshi to ask? It had been 2 years. It seemed like a fair thing to ask at this point, especially if Midoriya already knew about him. What was he so afraid of that if he trusted him? It didn't make sense. Either he didn't trust him and was afraid of him, or he trusted him and wasn't afraid of him, right? Toshi, what just happened? He heard his mom's voice ask from the entrance to the computer room. Hitoshi was still standing in the spot Midoriya had left him. Is he okay? Are you okay? She trailed off as she looked at him, studying his face, trying to understand the emotions she was feeling. Against his better and more empathic judgment, his mind seemed to have settled on anger. It didn't make sense. Midoriya had to have lied to him. He wouldn't be that scared if he trusted him. He looked like he was running away from someone revving a bloody chainsaw at him. Like Hitoshi was going to do something awful if he stayed a second longer. Hitoshi knew that apprehension. He understood being scared of how Midoriya would react to him, but he was never afraid like that. Heck, Midoriya was less afraid when someone was actually trying to attack them in the street. What did he think Hitoshi was going to do? Why would he think he would do anything at all? Didn't he know him well enough by now to know that Hitoshi was his friend? That he wouldn't scorn him for something he couldn't control? Don't worry about it. We're fine. He had to leave early today and forgot. Hitoshi lied. It was an obvious lie, but he didn't care. He didn't want to hear his mom tell him that Midoriya was just as scared as he was, or that he'd come around, or he probably had his reasons. Hitoshi already knew that, but she didn't see the fear in his eyes. He was scared of Hitoshi just like everyone else, and he didn't want to tell her that. He didn't even want to think about that much less talk about it. So he sat back down at his computer and stuffed his headphones back onto his ears and started playing the math lecture he'd barely been listening to and would continue to ignore. He saw his mom linger in the doorway for a moment, but eventually she left. It didn't make him feel any better. The rest of Izuku's day was a blur of panic, fear, and worry. If he could get his mind to stray from how royally he had just messed up everything, then it just fell back to Hawks and Uptown. It was too much. It was all too much. Everything was going to hell in a handbasket, and he was just watching his life crumble around himself, and he couldn't do anything but watch. He couldn't do anything. He couldn't save himself from his own mess. He couldn't save Uptown from that piece of shit supplier that was ruining his streets, and he didn't have the faintest idea what to do about Hawks. He couldn't remember a dang thing anyone said to him all day, and when school let out, he let tired limbs carry him home. As he walked into the stairwell and flipped the lights on, he watched DJ blink up at him, slowly letting her eyes adjust like she did every day when he got back from school. Numbly, he let his backpack fall to the floor and shrugged off his jacket before flipping the space heater on and sliding his back down the wall until he was sat next to her. DJ, I finally screwed everything, he said with a humorless laugh. I'm surprised it took this long. She slowly blinked at him, looking unimpressed. I can't lose them. I can't. Tears were starting to form in his eyes. I told him I trusted him. I do trust him. It can't be coincidence. It can't be. There's no way I went my whole life never meeting anyone who gave a rat's ass about me, only to stumble onto not one, not two, but 3 people who actually give a shit, and they're the only ones who don't know I'm quirkless. There's no way. The tears were spilling down his cheeks in earnest now, and DJ had forced herself into the hollow between his arms and legs as he sat resting his elbows on his knees with his face in his hands. There's just no way. Even if I do tell them, they still don't know the half of me. They don't know what I've done. They don't know who I am. No one does. And it should stay that way. It needs to stay that way. No one could love this. At least not anyone who understood. DJ could love him. She did love him, but she was a cat. She didn't understand how broken he was. She didn't understand that he was fundamentally flawed. His shortcomings were hardwired into the very fabric of his being, into every each and every strand of his DNA. He was born wrong, and there was nothing he could do about it. No one could love that, and he had a decade of evidence to prove it. He was a relic of the past that should have been weeded out. He just slipped through the cracks. He wasn't supposed to be here. He shouldn't be here. But, oh, it had felt so good to pretend. What the hell am I supposed to say? What the hell do I do now? There's no fixing this, he choked out as the tears turned to messy sobs. DJ went from pushing her head against his stomach to fully invading his lap, forcing him to sit back to make room. She had her front paws on his chest and was seemingly trying to physically push the tears back into his eyes by shoving her face into his. And he couldn't help but laugh at that. She was so silly, but that didn't stop the tears from falling. It just piled good onto the bad. Izuku supposed that was better than nothing, though. By the time he composed himself, it was time to leave for patrol. He still hadn't gotten a text from Shinso. Kami, he really screwed this up, but he couldn't worry about that now. They needed to meet Eraser and figure out if he got any information that they couldn't on Hawks. They had other people counting on them. They couldn't sit here and dwell on their own inevitable relationship failures. End of chapter.